Welcome back all. We're going to talk about scientific illiterature freaks and the causes of autism throughout this episode. We'll be starting with what started the anti-vaccine rhetoric associating autism with vaccines, exacerbating the anti-vaccine movement, how the fraud and conspiracy was exposed, potential causes of autism, the diagnostic manuals, and the autism paradigm. Get settled and stay tuned. Before we dig into how all this started, I'm going to explain some common errors anti-vaxxers make about science. First, these scientifically illiterate anti-vaxxers don't understand scientists and not intending to prove themselves right. They are trying to prove themselves wrong. Science is about advancement. If you don't understand, this might help. I know my first name is Daniel. If I test every form of identification I have, and they all prove my claim right, what progression have I made? None. No new discoveries. I've just got what I started with. My name is Daniel. But if I looked for errors and found that a form of identification said my name was something else, that's an opportunity to increase accuracy and move forward. Right. As for second one, in science you cannot just make something up, such as anti-vaxxers just making up all of a sudden vaccines cause autism, and then demand others to prove it wrong. No evidence suggested vaccines cause autism, but there was evidence that showed it's most likely coincidental. It's easy to prove made-up bullshit is wrong. If you try to prove yourself right, you will make no progress. By anti-vaxxers continually trying to prove themselves right about something which is wrong, that's why they struggle to provide any evidence about a link between autism and vaccines. Those who actually are anti-vaxxers, who are con men, such as Andrew Wakefield. This time I'll use Robert Francis Kennedy Jr. as an example. Remember, RFK was an environmental lawyer, and he has done many lawsuits about anti-vaccines in his anti-vaccine campaign, so he has manipulation skills. I'm going to play two consecutive videos, two clips, of RFK speaking himself, where it sounds like he's speaking contrary to himself, as if he's contradicting, but I'll illustrate about this is the trickery of a lawyer.
Before I conclude, I want to make sure the committee is clear about a few things. News reports have claimed that I'm anti-vaccine or anti-industry. I am neither. I am pro-safety.
We'll have order. Please proceed.
I am pro-safety. I worked for years to raise awareness about the mercury and toxic chemicals in fish, and nobody called me anti-fish. And I believe that that vaccines play a critical role in healthcare. All of my kids are vaccinated. I've written many books on vaccines. My first book in 2014, the first line of it is, I am not anti-vaccine, and the last line is, I am not anti-vaccine.
You've talked about that the media slanders you by calling you an anti-vaxxer, and you've said that you're not anti-vaccine, you're pro-safe vaccine. Difficult question. Can you name any vaccines that you think are good?
There's no vaccine that is, safe and effective.
On the first clip, RFK went saying back in January at his confirmation hearing that he is pro-safe and that he is for vaccines, that he believes vaccines are very important for health. But then in the second clip, he went going and saying there is no safe or effective vaccine. Now, those two statements do seem contradictory. But how exactly can you think of a way of how they are not actually contradictory if RFK was actually an honest person? Because we know that he's internally dishonest. We do. But imagine he was internally honest for a moment and he actually believed those things. What he would point out on the first one, he said, I am pro-safety. He said that he is pro-safety for vaccines on the first clip, and on the second clip, when he said, there's no safe or effective vaccine, well, if there's no safe or effective vaccine, but he's for pro-safe, that means he's claiming he's not against vaccines, but he will only support safe vaccines, but because he believes there is no vaccines that are safe, he doesn't support any. They say of how that is trickery that comes from politicians and lawyers. As I said on a previous video I did, lawyers, politicians, no interest in truth. Just interested in winning a debate, defending a client, trying to reach their own objective. So you can see that that's his trickery. But since he actually had his own kids vaccinated, we know that he doesn't actually believe the things he says about vaccines. He doesn't believe they are the deadliest of things. He doesn't believe they cause all these chronic diseases. He just does it for the lawsuits. And that can be illustrated throughout his history.
Tonight, Dispatches reveals what parents were never told. How a major London teaching hospital and Dr. Andrew Wakefield launched a health scare which questioned the safety of the 3-in-1 MMR vaccine.
My opinion is that the MMR should be suspended in favour of the single vaccines.
How they planned a rival vaccine and products that could have made their fortune. And how when Dr. Wakefield warned that MMR might lead to autism, his own laboratory had carried out tests on children that dramatically contradicted his claims. But when push comes to shove, Dr. Andrew Wakefield is careful what he does and doesn't say.
Dr. Wakefield, I'm sorry to interrupt. Brian Deere, Channel 4 Television. Could I talk to you about your research, sir, and your commercial ambitions?
The anti-vaccine movement is nothing new. It's been going on since the 1800s, but I'm going to be focusing on how autism came into the vaccine rhetoric. All we know concerning the claim that autism is caused by vaccines comes down to one talented man called Brian Deere. I'll be sharing some of Brian Deere's work. You can find this full documentary in the description here on YouTube. If you would like to know all the details, I recommend his book called The Doctor Who Fooled the World. Autism wasn't part of the anti-vaccine rhetoric until Andrew Wakefield, Jackie Fletcher, John Walker Smith, Huff Fudenberg, and Richard Barr started a financial scam around 1994. It starts with a discussion between a mother called Jackie Fletcher and Andrew Wakefield, and Fletcher thinking her son was injured by the MMR vaccine. Fletcher opened a support group called JABS, standing for Justice, Awareness and Basic Support. JABS worked like a fuel to enable the financial scam. Andrew Wakefield had no education in vaccines, immunology, nor autism itself. He was a gastroenterologist who looked at bowel disorders. In this circumstance, specifically Crohn's disease. He saw Jackie Fletcher's autistic son and made a hypothesis. He supposed the measles caused Crohn's disease and inflammatory bowel diseases. He changed from the measles virus to the measles vaccine virus, assuming the MMR vaccine caused autism. Wakefield called it autistic enterocolitis. Jackie Fletcher wanted to sue vaccine manufacturers for her son's assumed vaccine injury. Due to this, Andrew Wakefield made a deal with a lawyer called Richard Barr. Barr paid the money for clinical and scientific studies to be done in the medical school, diverted to the hospital's Special Trustees Fund, where, rinsed of its origins, it was then laundered back to pay for Wakefield's research. In 1996, the research started. If Wakefield could move Fletcher's son was injured by a vaccine, Richard Barr, as a lawyer, could help Fletcher sue the MMR vaccine manufacturers. Since Fletcher founded JABS, where parents of people like her son went for support, she was able to recommend people to Wakefield. Barr could get more money being a lawyer for each parent of a child with a perceived vaccine injury for compensation. So Wakefield, Fletcher, and Barr had predetermined outcomes, causing confirmation bias, influencing them to manipulate data to create the evidence they wanted. When a second child was taken to Andrew Wakefield, things were more complicated. This case did not work in his favour because the child was showing signs of autism before he was vaccinated with the MMR vaccine. An Australian professor, John Walker-Smith, looked at the child's medical information and said there's no sign of Crohn's disease. Once he wanted to be in on the deal, he reclassified the child from healthy to diseased. It needs to be remembered, Wakefield is not a scientist. He was a surgeon. Parents and other medical professionals called the ethics of his research into question. Brian Deere spoke with the parents about what they saw. Brian records, I quote, "In all, he collapsed 3 times that day. She remembers. Other children in the study also suffered. It took 3 people, for instance, to hold down child 2, merely for a standard blood draw. A 4-year-old experienced such headache after lumbar puncture that, following discharge, his mother called an emergency doctor. And child 5, age 7, fared so badly from the same test, which had taken cerebrospinal fluid under general anaesthetic, that he was rushed by ambulance from his home to a local hospital and kept for 2 days observation." End of quote. Wakefield examined 12 children in total and submitted the paper to a medical journal called The Lancet. A former immunologist, Huff Fudenberg, in America, who had been sued by the Food and Drug Administration for drug misconduct. Fudenberg was actually the first to report a proposed link between the MMR vaccine and autism. While Wakefield is seen as the father of the anti-vaccine movement, Fudenberg is the grandfather of today's anti-vaccine movement. Fudenberg sent another parent and child from America to London in England to see Wakefield. In the laboratories at the medical school, someone called Nick Chadwick was the coordinating investigator, doing most of the research and studying on tissues taken from the children's small intestines, looking for the measles virus. Andrew Wakefield didn't really do any handwork. He was just a mouthpiece of the work that was done. Nick Chadwick said all the test results that didn't satisfy Wakefield's theory, he just ignored. Brian Deere visited and talked to Nick Chadwick. Nick reported he found no measles virus in any cases of the 12 children. I quote, "So you found no measles virus in the children who were presented to the public at the very foundation of the MMR scare, where Dr. Wakefield's theory was that it was measles virus itself that was responsible for a bowel disease, and then leading on to some kinds of autism, and you found no measles virus. End of quote. Brian Deere sounded very confused. Wakefield submitted the paper to the Lancet, even though he knew he was wrong by distorting the data, and Nick Chadwick saying no measles virus was found in the children. At a press conference shortly after, he lied to the audience when there were news cameras broadcasting to the public. Reporters were there, and others to spread false information, and the big MMR scare blew up from there. Brian Deere spoke to numerous professionals, and Wakefield's work was just nonsensical. So nonsensical that some professionals said to Brian, "Andrew Wakefield is just a fraudulent wanker." They used those terms specifically. It shouldn't be a surprise, as Wakefield was talking about things he knew nothing about.
At the government's Health Protection Agency, scientists watched the unfolding scare with alarm. Senior epidemiologist Dr. Mary Ramsey was baffled.
Dr. Andrew Wakefield believed that the MMR should be broken up into single vaccines. Can you think of any basis for that?
Absolutely none at all. There's nothing in his work that really suggests where that came from. And it really was a very unfortunate thing to say, because that's the thing that's had the most impact, I think, on the public, who are very confused now about whether there is some problem with combining the vaccine.
So from your point of view, this research and this proposal from the Royal Free Group, and Dr. Wakefield in particular, that the vaccine should be broken up, just came out of the blue?
Absolutely.
As I said near the beginning, in science you can't just make something up out of the blue and expect others to prove it's wrong. When you make a claim, the burden of proof is on you. Saying vaccines cause autism started an even bigger urgency to do further research on vaccine ingredients to confirm whether vaccines do or don't have a causal link to autism. Not one study around the globe has found a link between vaccines and autism, besides the ones which are methodologically flawed or have false analysis and conflict of interest. Once autism research showed traits associated with autism emerge between 1 and 2 years old in development. Since the MMR vaccine is offered during that time, doctors confirm someone appearing autistic shortly after a vaccine is coincidental, not causal. If you look on the chart, you'll see measles, mumps and rubella, MMR, is due at 12 months, the approximate time autism symptoms begin to develop. In the 1990s, they removed mercury and thimerosal from the vaccines. Once they did, autism diagnosis rates didn't drop. Diagnosis kept increasing, showing no correlation with the vaccine ingredients. If you look at this graph, you'll see whether someone is vaccinated or not doesn't seem to show any causal link. Anyway, back to why did Andrew Wakefield want to go back and let people have the vaccines individually? Once again, Brian Deere found the answer for everyone. He writes, I quote, "No wonder the excitement when he thought child 2 had Crohn's. Wakefield had already filed a patent, lodged in his own name, from his home address. His claims were frankly astonishing. Not only did he profess to have discovered a means of diagnosing the disease, as well as ulcerative colitis, by detecting measles virus in bowel tissue and blood, he also registered a medicament for treating these diseases, and, even more remarkably, a measles vaccine comprising a system which expresses part of all of the measles virus genome." End of quote. Andrew Wakefield had a vaccine of his own for the measles, but as long as the MMR vaccine was still in medical practice, there would be no need for Wakefield's vaccine. If Wakefield got his way, and they were separated, people could choose his measles vaccine over the other for his financial gain. This was clearly a conflict of interest. Wakefield wanted to make his own organisation called Carmel Healthcare. It didn't take long for people to realise his wife's name is Carmel. In the year 2000, Wakefield attended another conference. This was a turning point on the new feedback loop. A London lawsuit, through his secret deal with Richard Barr, I mentioned, wasn't just to pay the fees, but to create his Carmel Healthcare. Having his own organisation could lead to making tens of millions of pounds and so much fame. Even though Andrew Wakefield kept failing to prove his invented disease was caused by the MMR vaccine, he kept publicising scientific statements without any evidence for his statements. He just kept making things up that suited his agenda. As a consequence, he was mutually terminated as a doctor from the hospital in London. On screen is the paper which Wakefield published, which is retracted from the Lancet. If you look in the orange box, it says, I quote, "We did not prove an association between measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine and the syndrome described. Virological studies are underway that may help to resolve this issue." Close quote. Out of the 12 children investigated, 8 out of 12 blamed autism on the MMR vaccine, and some of the children were not even autistic. A sample size of 12 is ridiculous. You cannot find conclusive data on such small sample sizes. Antidotes from parents are not evidence, according to the scientific method. I can see why someone would believe A causes B if B happens shortly after A, but it is logically fallacious. Wakefield and the parents said the children were not always autistic because symptoms didn't emerge until 12 to 24 months. If you look at the actual evidence concerning autism, it becomes obvious vaccines don't cause autism. Look at this first chart. The red line represents an autistic brain from birth to 2 years old. During early years, autistic brains grow an excessive amount of neurons and brain cells, which exceeds neurotypical brains into overgrowth. Now look at this diagram of ASD, ADHD, and quote-unquote normal. Around 2 years old, something called synaptic pruning starts. Look at how there appears to be far more in an autistic brain because of the overgrowth shown on the previous graph. Research suggests that altered brain pruning, specifically underpruning, might contribute to the developmental regression seen in some autistic individuals where skills like language and social interaction are lost. It was already developing from within the womb, and when they came out, that excessive amount of neurons, it was in the process of developing, and it continued to develop, and by doing so, there were too many neurons there that the pruning couldn't prune enough of them out. But there were that many left within it in the autistic brain. Now, look at this comparison between an autistic brain and the neurotypical brain. Because of the synaptic pruning, autistic people use the back of the brain more, which is more tuned into the objective and visual world, while non-autistic people use the front of the brain more, which is more tuned into the social world. This is what science is, following the rules of the scientific method. By doing so, it helps scientists make further progress. This is not based on things coming out of the blue or antidotes. It is based on evidence. And if we continue allowing scientists to follow the scientific method, they will make progress if they keep looking for what might be wrong with what they're presently saying. So from what I've just read up to now about the brain development, comparing autistic to non-autistic, They're going to be looking for errors within those claims. When they find the errors, they'll be able to make more progression, then we may be able to provide more help, come up with therapies, which may be of assistance to autistic kids. In scientific discourse, you are not to confuse correlation with causation. Two things happening together doesn't mean one causes the other. Back on the 22nd of September 2025, Trump, RFK, McArray and Oz announced in the Oval Office of the White House that Tylenol, technically called acetaminophen, causes autism. This illustrates how logically fallacious correlation causation is. Autism research shows illnesses during pregnancy increase the likelihood of having an autistic child. Pregnant women consume acetaminophen for fever, an illness. Telling women to not treat their fever during pregnancy increases the chance of having an autistic child. That's how the Trump administration trumps itself. In that case, we had three factors: autism, fever, and acetaminophen. By dismissing why the pregnant woman is consuming acetaminophen, they came to the false and dangerous conclusions. But what caused the woman's fever? Is that a possible environmental factor? Science is not so simple. One of Robert F. Kennedy's arguments is as vaccines have increased, autism has increased, so vaccines must cause autism. If an increase of vaccines was causing an increase of autism, autism should have stopped increasing each time vaccines stopped increasing. They should be in consistent correlation, but are not. If Tylenol was the cause of autism, it would be in consistent correlation with consumption of Tylenol. Do all of these up above on this graph, does this look like correlation? RFK said at his hearing on the 4th of September 2025, I quote, CDC did an internal study of Atlanta, Fulton County, Georgia children and looked at children who got the MMR vaccine on time and compared those kids to the kids who got them later. So, in other words, kids who got them before 36 months and kids who got them afterward, the data from that study showed that black boys who got the vaccine on time had a 260% greater chance of getting an autism diagnosis than children who waited. Close quote. The study Robert F. Kennedy was referring to was questioned because of serious concerns on the 28th of August 2014 by an organization called Translational Neurodegeneration. It was not retracted by the CDC, as RFK alleged. The organization said, I quote, as a result, Translational Neurodegeneration, the journal in which Hooker's study was published, released this statement. This article has been removed from the public domain because of serious concerns about the validity of its conclusions. The journal and publisher believe that its continued availability may not be in the public interest. Definitive editorial action will be pending further investigation. Further investigation was done. After further investigation, the paper was retracted on the 3rd of October 2014. It was concluded, I quote, the editor and publisher regretfully retract the article as there were undeclared competing interests on the part of the author which compromised the peer review process. Furthermore, post-publication peer review raised concerns about the validity of the methods and statistical analysis. Therefore, the editors no longer have confidence in the soundness of the findings. We apologize to all affected parties for the inconvenience caused. Close quote. The leader of the study is called Brian S. Hooker. It doesn't surprise me. Brian S. Hooker is another anti-vaccine activist. Brian Hooker is widely considered a prominent vaccine skeptic, an anti-vaccine activist known for promoting discredited theories about a vaccine autism link, particularly involving the CDC and the MMR vaccine, often working with Andrew Wakefield and featuring in the anti-vaccine film Vaxxed. His claims stem from allegations of a CDC cover-up, which centers on a 2004 study that found a correlation between the MMR vaccine and autism in African American boys. Both subsequent analysis by the CDC showed this correlation disappeared when data was properly analyzed, a point Hooker disputes. All the links will be in the description. But the letter said, in an era marked by widespread misinformation about vaccines, it is crucial to rely on solid scientific evidence. Large population-based register studies like this one, tracking more than 1 million children over many years, is a bulwark against the politicization of health science, which undermines public trust in vaccines. It is absolutely essential to distinguish real science from politically motivated campaigns. Otherwise, it is the children who will end up paying the price, says Anders Hibbard. This was a study called Large Danish Study, No Link Between Vaccines and Autism or 49 Other Health Conditions. A study which Robert F. Kennedy demanded to be removed because it proved that aluminium does not have anything to do with autism. To sum up Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s vaccine movements, before he was made Secretary of HHS, he was the chairman of the Children's Health Defense, publishing anti-vaccine rhetoric. At the confirmation hearing in January 2025, he promised he would not affect vaccines and ASIP. Senator Bill Cassidy was instrumental in RFK's confirmation, but only agreed to confirm because of RFK's promises. In March 2025, RFK hired David Geer as a senior data analyst to examine the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's vaccine safety data to look for evidence of a link between vaccines and autism. David Geer and his father, Mark Geer, are known anti-vaccine activists who previously lost access to the CDC data for misrepresenting their research plans and attempting to manipulate the data. In April 2025, RFK Jr. announced he will find the cause of autism by September 2025. It's not a surprise the next vaccine meeting was organised to be in September 2025 with other anti-vaccine activists. RFK Jr. removed all 17 members of the Advisory Committee on Immunisation Practices in June 2025 and replaced them with other anti-vaccine activists who will rubber stamp his anti-vaccine rhetoric. RFK publicly demanded the retraction of a 2025 Danish study that found no link between aluminium in vaccines and chronic childhood diseases and autism. The journal, Annals of Internal Medicine, rejected his demand in August 2025. On the 25th of August 2025, RFK attempted to fire Susan Monarez, the former director of the CDC, just because she refused to rubber stamp his anti-vaccine rhetoric and sack scientists without cause. He got Trump to fire her on the 27th of August 2025. On the 22nd of September, RFK announced in the Oval Office of the White House acetaminophen is the cause of autism. RFK replaced Susan Monterez with another anti-vaccine activist, Jim O'Neill, who claims to be pro-vaccine. If he was pro-vaccine, he wouldn't be rubber stamping RFK's anti-vaccine agenda. RFK Jr. personally ordered a change to the CDC's website language on vaccines and autism on November the 19th, 2025. This change altered the CDC's long-standing public position that vaccines do not cause autism. On a podcast in June, Kennedy falsely claimed that the hepatitis B vaccine is a likely culprit of autism and has now removed it from the recommendation list. Robert Francis Kennedy Jr.'s first year as Secretary of Health and Human Services has paved his pseudo-scientific belief system that vaccines cause autism. He has shown no concern about addressing the actual causes of health problems, such as poverty and inequity. He's only been concerned about autism and vaccines. He is doing exactly what Andrew Wakefield did back in 1998. Science is built upon paradigms. Basically speaking, scientific paradigms are frameworks or models made out of theories, assumptions, methods based on legitimate science. These paradigms are guides for scientists to explore and solve problems in a shared way. Having a shared framework or model enables scientists to repeat studies globally among different groups of people or whichever phenomenon is being explored. At this point in time, the autism paradigm has a genetic and biological basis. Scientists are to play devil's advocate. They are searching for errors in their own works. Errors may sound negative to those who don't understand the scientific method. Finding errors is actually progression. When scientists find any error, they have learned something which is not right. When contrary evidence is found, there's two options. We either have a paradigm modification or a paradigm shift. Daniel Little writes, I quote, "When scientists encounter anomalies to their theories, they must choose whether to abandon the theory altogether or modify it to make it consistent with the contrary observations. If the theory has a wide range of supporting evidence, aside from the contrary experience, there is a powerful incentive in favour of salvaging the theory by modifying the original paradigm." Close quote. The autism paradigm has modified a principle. Instead of thinking of autism as something wrong or dysfunctional, it's been thought of human diversity, not just paying much attention to what people struggle with, but paying just as much attention to what autistic people can do. Paradigms and models can be reframed. Autism is being looked at through a few models now, called the medical model, the social model, and some called PhD Robert Chapman made something called the ecological model. The biological perspective is making progress towards identifying potential causes of autism. I'm going to go through the National Foundation for Infectious Diseases to help show a growing paradigm, and I'll share some research that is pointing us to a paradigm modification. Part 1 says, I quote, "Genetics. An overwhelming amount of evidence points to genetics. In about 15 to 20% of autism cases, one genetic variant can explain autism features. In other cases, there may be multiple genetic changes interacting to cause autism. In the past few years, we have moved beyond identifying genes and have begun studying how to correct genetic mutations to restore function. Studies focused on gene editing are underway. Autism runs in families. Siblings of a child with autism are 15 times more likely to be diagnosed with autism, while nieces and nephews of a person with autism have a 3 times increased risk rate. End of quote. It's this heritability that lays a genetic framework as a paradigm to base theories, assumptions, and methods of investigation upon in order to explore autism. Next, environment. Researchers are examining how environmental factors work independently and in conjunction with genes to cause autism. Environmental factors associated with an autism diagnosis include 1. Being male. Boys are diagnosed 4 times more often than girls, and new research indicates that being female builds resilience to autism, as females require larger genetic changes to show symptoms of autism. Close quote. This can be complemented by biological differences we've seen between males and females. Autistic males have lower levels of a hormone called oxytocin, for example. Oxytocin is the hormone responsible for bondage, so it can be harder for autistic boys to make bondages and friends. Next, being born prematurely. Children born prematurely or with extremely low birth weight are more likely to have autism. Close quote. This can also be complemented by inflammation during pregnancy or over the neonatal period, common in preterm births. It's a potential pathway as it's also implicated in autism. The next one. Having an older parent or parents. Higher age at connection of either the mother or father or both adds to the likelihood of an autism diagnosis. Close quote. This is further supported by the genetic perspective. Older people produce more genetic mutations, which increases the probability an offspring will have the mutations that make the development of autism possible. Higher age can even be supported by culture. As culture has changed to most people getting pregnant at a later age than in the past, it's one possible reason autism prevalence has increased. Another one is illness during pregnancy. Certain illnesses like rubella and influenza during pregnancy can increase the likelihood that a child will be diagnosed with autism. Close quote. I would say this is a good example could be illustrated by back in September where I mentioned earlier about acetaminophen, where it's not actually acetaminophen that could be causing autism, it could be the fever. The fever of why were the pregnant women consuming acetaminophen. So that's illustrated by in those studies, the ones about acetaminophen. And the next one says, I quote, exposures during pregnancy. Exposure to some anti-epileptic drugs, as well as high levels of air pollution during pregnancy, has been associated with autism in children. Close quote. Observation has shown epilepsy is very common among people with an autism diagnosis. People with epilepsy will be exposed to anti-epileptic drugs. So an autistic mother with epilepsy is even more likely to have a child with autism. So we could see that possibly an increase in drugs, an increase of medical advancement, could possibly be increasing the rates. Right. But when we go looking at things from a cultural level, when we see things, we see that disability in general is contextual altogether, so it brings culture into things. So, such as we found a lot of autistic people have gastrointestinal problems, but this tends to be caused by things like mothers having diabetes, but the diabetes comes from things like ultra-processed foods, obesity. So we're even finding that the way our cultures are is influencing the way a mother is and father, which is influencing the fetus in the womb. So we've got quite a lot of things interconnected within this. So I would like you to realise how this shows autism requires a multidisciplinary approach. The facts I've mentioned point us to biology, sociology, genetics, neurology, immunology, medicine, dietary, anthropology, psychiatry, psychology, physiology, evolution, environment, and philosophy. How many different science disciplines was that? Plus philosophy. All to do with one condition. So, do you really think one vaccine being given to someone being vaccinated could cause a condition this complex? How does it address all the subjects I just mentioned? This illustrates extreme complexity, which requires great care to be evidence-based science, instead of basing things on bewildering statements like vaccines cause autism, Tylenol causes autism, circumcision causes autism. It's evident anti-vaxxers have no understanding of the scientific method. We are just going to listen to the world's leading autism researcher, Professor Simon Baron-Cohen of the University of Cambridge in the UK.
There are very clear sex differences in the brain, and we see these differences right from birth. Some people wonder whether these differences in the size of the brain or in the size of different parts of the brain have any impact on the child's psychological development. And certainly we know that girls talk earlier than boys, their language is developing faster, and the regions of the brain that are involved in language are larger in females than in males. The finding that the amygdala is larger in boys is interesting because in boys' and girls' social development, their understanding of other people's emotions, girls seem to develop faster, their empathy is better on average, and this may well relate to this difference in the size of the amygdala. Our research has been looking at whether children and indeed adults with autism might have an extreme of the male brain. So autism is a developmental condition where people have difficulty in developing friendships, relationships, communication, but where they also get very focused, sometimes called obsessional. And we've been interested to see whether the structure of the autistic brain might be an extreme of what we see in the typical male. When you compare groups of children with autism and without autism, children with autism show faster brain development, sometimes thought of as an overgrowth in the early years. And when you actually compare different parts of the brain, some structures fit this extreme male pattern. So the amygdala, which is larger in a typical male, is even larger in a child with autism. The corpus callosum, which is larger in a typical female, is even smaller in a child with autism. But we're also looking at these patterns in terms of psychology. So do children with autism show a profile that would match an extreme male profile? If it's the case that boys are developing slower socially and in terms of language, well then it's very clear that children with autism are developing social relationships and language even more slowly. So in that respect, it does seem to fit. Some of the differences in the way the mind develops in boys and girls and the way the brain develops in boys and girls may reflect genetic differences. And if genes are involved, then it's only one small step to imagine that these may have been shaped by evolution, selected by evolution. And one view is that, in fact, in our early ancestry, our hominid ancestry, males and females occupied very different niches, different roles, with females taking much more of a role in childcare and in the community, much more of a social role, and with males having a much more of a solitary role in navigation of the landscape in search of resources. My own position is that I think biology and culture interact to create these sex differences. So I'm not a strong biological determinist, but neither am I a strong cultural or social determinist. I think there's a mix that comes together to create them. There are some people who would argue just for biology or just for culture, but I think the moderate position is to recognise that both are at work. I think there's a responsibility for people who look at sex differences to do so in a very careful, evidence-based way. It's very easy to make sweeping statements about groups of people, including the two sexes, which could easily become forms of discrimination or generalizations which simply don't apply. So research in this area, I think, can proceed, but it has to be very responsible. It has to be done in a responsible fashion, so not claiming more than can be reasonably claimed on the basis of evidence.
A problem with diagnosis manuals is they are not purely scientific, but heavily based on cultural norms, making the manuals culturally biased. The experiences of neurodivergent people proves this. Whether someone gets a diagnosis or not depends on the classifications and social judgments of the psychiatrists. In a local clinic in their own culture, they get said to not be autistic, but when they go to a clinic in a more foreign culture, they get a diagnosis. That shows subjectivity. If the diagnosis was purely scientific, the results would be objective. Regardless of which clinic, regardless of which culture, all psychiatrists would give the same result. Dr. Gabriel Maté writes in his book, The Myth of Normal, I quote, "When I got into psychiatry, Dr. Bruce Perry told me it became clear really quickly that the diagnoses were not connected to the physiology, that they were just descriptive, and that there were hundreds of physiological roots to someone having an attention problem, for example. And yet the profession acted as if these descriptive tools were really a thing. I knew that if we were just doing research, if we were using these hollow descriptors which were called diagnoses, and then study interventions and outcomes, we would just get garbage, and that's what we've done." Close quote. By basing diagnosis on observation by eyes alone, there's no certainty it's a correct diagnosis. Labels are not really a diagnosis, from my view. I think they would better be described as more of a support map. By everyone having a label, the label will point them in a direction, just like a satellite nav, to the support they require, not just for disabled people. Another problem with the diagnosis manuals is they only pay attention to what are seen as quote-unquote deficits. That's a big waste. Neurodivergent individuals often have unique strengths and abilities. These strengths can be harnessed in various fields, and arts and sciences to business and technology. One of the key strengths of neurodivergent individuals is their ability to think differently. They often bring fresh perspectives and innovative solutions to problems, enriching discussions and decision-making processes. Another strength is in their ability to focus intensely on tasks that interest them. This can lead to exceptional performance and deep expertise in specific areas. Additionally, disease or illness is a social construct. All of nature that is seen below mankind are exempt from both disease and from treatment. Until people intervene with their own classifications of disease and treatment, left-handedness is a human invention. Because we create a cultural model that suits right-handed people, anyone who cannot fit into the model will always be labelled as something other than. Gilbert Keith Chesterton wrote, I quote, "Mr. Wells' point was this, that we cannot be certain about the inheritance of health, because health is not a quality. It is not a thing like darkness in the hair or length in the limbs. It is a relation, a balance. You have a tall, strong man, but his very strength depends on his not being too tall for his strength. You catch a healthy, full-blooded fella, but his very health depends on his not being too full of blood. A heart that is strong for a dwarf will be weak for a giant. A nervous system that would kill a man with a trace of a certain illness will sustain him to 90 if he has no trace of that illness. Nay, the same nervous system might kill him if he had an excess of some other comparatively healthy thing. Seeing, therefore, that there are healthy people of all types, it is obvious that if you make two of them, you may then even produce a discord out of two inconsistent harmonies. Close quote. Diagnostic manuals are systematic models, and systematic models cannot account for human diversity. That's what makes diagnosis lose scientific credibility. We cannot live by the medicalised framing of human diversity as if there's only one right way to be healthy, and then claim it to be scientific. Anti-vaccine rhetoric doesn't take science seriously. The reason scientifically illiterate anti-vaxxers point the finger at Big Pharma is because anti-vaxxers are playing the same financial game, such as they don't want to do vaccines because they believe it causes autism, and they don't want to have an autistic child because they think it'll bankrupt them. They're just concerned about the money, not the well-being of the child. They're basically saying, stop giving your money to Big Pharma and give it to us instead. Here's Senator Elizabeth Warren on the 6th of January 2025 at Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s confirmation hearing. She spells it out perfectly well, and I would say we've seen what she predicted has happened throughout this year.
Kennedy, I want to start with something that I think you and I agree on, and that is that Big Pharma has too much power in Washington. You said that President Trump asked you to, quote, clean up corruption and conflicts. Sounds great. You said that you will, quote, slam shut the revolving door between government agencies and the companies they regulate. That also sounds great. So here's an easy question. Will you commit that when you leave this job, you will not accept compensation from a drug company, a medical device company, a hospital system, or a health insurer for at least 4 years, including as a lobbyist or a board member?
Can you just repeat the last part of the question? Can I commit
You're
to
not going to take money from drug companies in any way, shape, or form.
Who? Me?
Yes, you.
Oh. Yeah, I'm happy to commit to that.
Okay, good. That's what I figured. I said it's an easy question to start with. And I think you're right on this question.
I don't think any of them want to give me money, by the way.
Let's keep going. You're right, because to say yes, because every American has the right to know that every decision you make as our number one health officer is to help them and not to make money for yourself in the future. So I want to talk more about money. I'm looking at your paperwork right now. In the past 2 years, you've raked in $2.5 million from a law firm called Wisner Baum. You go online, you do commercials to encourage people to sign up with Wisner Baum to join lawsuits against vaccine makers. And for everyone who signs up, you personally get paid. And if they win their case, you get 10% of what they win. So if you bring in somebody who gets $10 million, you walk away with $1 million. Now, you just said that you want the American people to know you can't be bought. Your decisions won't depend on how much money you could make in the future. You won't go to work for a drug company after you leave HHS. But you and I both know there's another way to make money. So, Mr. Kennedy, will you also agree that you won't take any compensation from any lawsuits against drug companies while you are secretary and for 4 years afterwards?
Well, I'll certainly commit to that while I'm secretary. But I do want to clarify something because you're making me sound like a shill. I put together that case. I did the Science Day presentation to the judge on that case to get it into court.
Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kennedy, it's just a really simple question.
Yeah,
You've taken in $2.5 million. I want to know if you will commit right now that not only will you not go to work for drug companies, you won't go to work suing the drug companies and taking your rake out of that while you're a secretary and for 4 years after. It's just...
I'll commit to not taking any fees from drug companies while I'm secretary.
No, I'm asking about fees from suing drug companies. Will you agree not to do that?
You're asking me to not sue drug companies,
no,
and I'm not going to agree to that,
drug
Senator.
Companies as much as you want.
I'm not going to agree to not sue drug companies or anybody.
So let's do a quick count here of how, as Secretary of HHS, if you get confirmed, you could influence every one of those lawsuits. Well, let me start the list. You could publish your anti-vaccine conspiracies, but this time on U.S. government letterhead, something a jury might be impressed by. You could appoint people to the CDC vaccine panel who share your anti-vax views and let them do your dirty work. You could tell the CDC vaccine panel to remove a particular vaccine from the vaccine schedule. You could remove vaccines from special compensation programs, which would open up manufacturers to mass torts. You could make more injuries eligible for compensation, even if there is no causal evidence. You could change vaccine court processes to make it easier to bring junk lawsuits. You could turn over FDA data to your friends at the law firm, and they could use it however it benefited them. You could change vaccine labeling. You could change vaccine information rules. You could change which claims are compensated in the vaccine injury compensation program. There's a lot of ways that you can influence those future lawsuits and pending lawsuits while you are Secretary of HHS. And I'm asking you to commit right now that you will not take a financial stake in every one of those lawsuits so that what you do as Secretary will also benefit you financially down the line.
I'll comply with all the ethical guidelines.
That's not the question. You and I, you have said
you're asking me, Senator, you're asking me not to sue vaccine pharmaceutical companies. Yeah, you are. That's exactly what you're doing.
No. Look, no one should be fooled here. As Secretary of HHS, Robert Kennedy will have the power to undercut vaccines and vaccine manufacturing across our country. And for all of his talk about follow the science and his promise that he won't interfere with those of us who want to vaccinate his kids, the bottom line is the same. Kennedy can kill off access to vaccines and make millions of dollars while he does it. Kids might die, but Robert Kennedy can keep cashing in.
In conclusion, the anti-vaccine movement is nothing new. It was amplified by Andrew Wakefield, just making the claim that the MMR vaccine causes autism, with no valid evidence, and it was foolish of the news to go broadcasting this out to the public when it was not confirmed without evidence. This scared the general public into vaccine hesitancy and the nonsensical belief vaccines cause autism. Andrew Wakefield was a trained surgeon for bowel disorders. He had no training to do scientific discourse, no education in epidemiology, no education about how vaccines work, and no education about autism itself. Looking back over just the actions of Andrew Wakefield and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., there is a lesson to be learned here by the parallels between them. They both engage in war against vaccines while accepting vaccinations themselves and for their families. So they're not actually against vaccines. Both of them have used vaccines as a way of financial gain from lawsuits and selling their own products to substitute vaccines. Neither of them are transparent about their public affairs by lying to the public. There's always something happening behind closed doors. The actual anti-vaxxers, who do support and trust those like Wakefield and Kennedy are not the villains, but are actually the victims of scientifically illiterate frauds taking advantage of the public's scientific illiteracy. Putting scientifically illiterate freaks in charge of health destroys scientific credibility and leads to harmful results, false conclusions, and even death. Robert F. Kennedy, as HHS Secretary this year, his anti-vaccine rhetoric has discredited the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, as this image should show. And when I ask people about why don't they trust vaccines, when I trace it back, found to where did they get their information from, where did they get theirs from, it always traces back to these two. Back to the godfather, the grandfather, and the father of the myth that vaccines cause autism. I hope this video has been informative. If you liked this content, please subscribe. Thank you.